Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve those so-called wicked problems. In today's somewhat playful episode, we discover that we gotta catch 'em all using the popular gaming app Pokémon Go, particularly about digital gamification and educational practices. Given that the media franchise just celebrated its 25th anniversary, Pokémon Go's enormous popularity and quick ascent to prominence made sense when it was first released a handful of years ago. From the Game Boy games to the trading cards, anime, and memorabilia galore, the majority of us, including myself, grew up with these adored so-called pocket monsters at the onset of the 2000s. So, major nostalgia factor. However, the dominant attitude of environmentalism appears to be almost post-apocalyptic and full of doom and gloom, in contrast to the benevolence and positive outlook that Pokemon appears to convey in forging bonds with creatures other than humans. In its early days, Pokemon was particularly controversial, and we may play the devil's advocate and argue that it encouraged animal cruelty by showcasing domesticated pets as some sort of magical creatures competing on the field. However, as it has gained popularity, particularly due to the success of gaming apps like Pokémon Go, it appears to have had the exact opposite effect, with many people utilizing it to learn about and explore various ecosystems, habitat preservation, and how human activity affects wildlife, especially in regards to climate action. So, is it possible to use Pokémon Go's purpose to accomplish environmental stewardship? Amber McLeod, whose work focuses on using technology to promote student learning and the development of transferable skills, was one of the Australian researchers and lecturers in education studies at Monash University with whom I had a dialogue. As she investigates the most effective methods for preparing pre-service teachers to use digital technology in the classroom. Amber's research and teaching interests are closely related. Additionally, the other researcher is Kelly Carabott, whose studies concentrate on how digital technology is used in homes, schools, and childhood. In the end, she investigates how this technology affects literacy, instruction, and learning. I learned more about how using digital technology, particularly gamification, through games such as Pokémon Go, may support educational learning and development as a result of today's episode. So stay tuned. Okay, so before we actually get into the questions, normally I get participants to play an icebreaker. We added this in after the fact, but we find it's a good way to get to know everyone. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you a list of adjectives, and you're just going to pick one word from the list. And the whole goal is not necessarily to typecast you as like type A or B or anything like that, but we just want to get to know, I guess, your persona in regards to your calling or your vocation. Okay, sent. And just to give you a bit of context, so you're familiar with Pokemon Go, of course, but it's kind of funny, but like the list has been generated it's inspired by, Pokemon itself, because they're like magical creatures, or like in the video games itself, not to nerd out. They're based on these like different personas. So yeah, you can just choose one each.
Hey, I think I'm going to say jolly.
Okay.
That's true, actually. I'm going to say
Okay,
quirky.
great. And why did you choose? Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I like that you chose. Normally people choose like bold, but I like jolly. I haven't gotten that one yet. Okay. And for Kelly, yours was
Quirky.
quirky. Okay. And do you want to explain why you chose jolly and quirky in regards to like your vocation?
I guess in terms of teaching, I like my classes to be fun. I want to have a good time. I want the students to have a good time. So I'm always trying to, make sure everything's fun. I think you learn best when you're having fun. So that's why.
Okay.
And as for me, obviously, also, spent all of my life teaching, quirky in the sense that, one of my specialties is children's literature. So, looking at things that are slightly left of centre, to find out the interesting little nooks and crannies that might not be obvious at first glance. So, so quirky. I like, lots of different things in, around pop culture. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. I haven't gotten those before. Thank you for sharing. But before we actually jump into more questions, I actually want to ask you what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious.
Okay. So I guess my area of research and the area I teach in is digital technologies in education in general. And it's never boring because there's always some new technology coming in. So at the moment, of course, there's a lot of stuff happening with Gen AI, and it's just revolutionizing the whole education sector. So that is making me really uneasy, but at the same time, I can't wait to, like, I'm constantly trying this and trying that to see what will work. I guess it's kind of exciting to be right at the coalface. Like it's all developing now. It's brand new. It's going to change the world. It's already changing the world, and we're there. So that makes it really exciting that we can get in there and trial this new stuff. So while it makes you feel uncertain, confused, I kind of like that space. I'm always encouraging my students to take risks, which is not generally encouraged in education, to model failure, because we want our own students, right, to say, oh, it doesn't matter if I get it wrong. I just have to keep working my way through it and seeing what I learn at the end.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing, Amber. And what about you, Kelly?
Well, I was thinking about uncertain. That's I'm not sure. I think we're always uncertain. I think the world that we live in is a very uncertain place with everything, as Amber has said, particularly around technology, is changing all the time. And I think, the world itself is full of uncertainty. So I think we live with that every day. For me, my curiosity is the intersection of my research is children's literature and literacy and looking at digital technologies. So, in particular, I'm really curious about how things like video games and children's literature, can kind of support understandings around, a whole myriad of different topics that we're talking to children, about who are going to be growing up, into this world. So I'm curious as to, the different types of mediums that are out there that we can use for educative purposes.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing, both of you. And actually, before we actually get into more questions, I'm going to get you both to formally introduce yourselves. So what you are, what you do, and who you are, you can just share.
Okay, so my name's Amber McLeod, and I am a lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. And I teach students who are going to be teachers about using technology in education. And that means both in the teaching of the traditional subjects, how could they use it? How can they ensure that when students leave school, they have the digital literacy needed in order to function in society? But also in Australia in 2016, we got a new digital technologies curriculum in schools. And so the people that I'm working with now who are going to be teachers didn't do that when they were at school. So it's a brand new thing that I'm introducing them to.
Interesting.
And my name is Dr. Kelly Carabott. I'm also a lecturer at Monash University in Australia. In terms of my my research and my teaching, I'm also a teacher educator. So teaching the teachers and thinking about that next generation entering the profession. My research itself is around multimodal texts. So when we think about multimodality, we're thinking about all of these texts that we're exposed to over a variety of different modes. So, for example, how does music affect the meaning of a text? How do the images come in? And if we think about in the 21st century, the saturation of images, and how they portray certain things is a really interesting space to be working in. So I'm really interested in contemporary multimodal texts and how children, but also teachers, can understand different ways of working with them in terms of educative purposes around a whole different range of topics.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introductions. To go into the first question, so you already kind of mentioned in both of your introductions, but tell me a bit more about yourself. So your struggles, your aspirations, and contributions, I guess that led you to getting involved in digital education, gamification, in learning and teaching practices. So how did you come about that?
I guess for me, it was kind of through my teaching, actually, more than my research. So looking at educational games, using games in education, which is not the same as educational games, and gamification. And so in order to teach my classes about that, of course, I had to get into it. And it was really interesting to look at all the pedagogical aspects that are embedded in just normal games. And they're so effective. And really, as educators, we can learn a lot about how to engage and motivate students through what's been done in the games. So that's sort of how I got interested in that area. Yeah.
Okay. And mine, I think it's something I've always been interested in. I remember myself as a young child, I was always interested in playing video games and reading and all of those different types of texts. And then when I actually started teaching the teachers, so as a teacher educator, what I was finding was that I was having some interesting conversations where they were viewing that there's only one way to kind of teach a certain concept, and that is maybe, for example, the teacher just standing up the front and talking about it, or that we only read books, that other forms of mediums actually can't teach us those things. And so that kind of led me into these spaces. And my PhD research actually was on looking at digital and paper-based texts and the differences in terms of teachers' pedagogy in classrooms and how students react to different, it's about being on that contemporary edge of, what is considered to be a text in education. I think for me, that's what I was really curious about.
Okay, great. And just moving on to the next question. So what is your personal definition of sustainable development and sustainability? Both of you.
I guess I actually live in the bush. So around me, I'm surrounded by trees and kangaroos and stuff.
Oh.
So sustainability is kind of twofold for me. One is it's about the natural environment, but the other one is it's about the built environment. And for example, when I'm teaching in my classes, our curriculum here for technologies is divided into two parts. One is digital technologies and the other one is design and technology, but they're very, very closely related. And a lot of the design and technology part is about what materials are we going to use for this? And how suitable are the materials in terms of what are their properties, but also is it something that is a sustainable crop, or what's going to happen to it when it's finished, or could we recycle something? So a lot of for example, yesterday I was just in with my tutors doing an activity where we had old cereal boxes and we were creating things out of those. So to me, it's especially in technology, you use so many raw materials, I do in my classes, to make things that I'm constantly taking in egg cartons and, whatever I have at home, bottle caps and everything, because we can use them. We can melt down the bottle caps to make 3D printing material and so on. So yeah, I guess it's two kinds of things. One is natural and one is in the built environment for me.
Mm. And I suppose for me, although this is not my exact area of expertise, I can certainly talk about it from a literature perspective and a personal perspective. So sustainability for me is about the interconnectedness of people and nature, and how we're positioning that in terms of the ways that we work with nature and nature works with us, and this kind of balance that's achieved between the both. So, for me, sustainability is quite a wide term that encompasses, conservation, as well, waste management, lots of recycling, lots of different things. In terms of sustainable education, for me, it's about knowledge. It's about the aesthetic feeling. So, can we develop some empathy, some different ways of thinking about how we interact in terms. So I wouldn't say that for me, sustainable education is not just about knowledge. It's, as Amber has mentioned, she lives in the bush, it's about experiences. It's about feeling. It's about having that empathy and that aesthetic experience around that, which is really important, which is where multimodal texts come in really handy in this particular space, because we know, that something like music, for example, in a video game can, really, get that aesthetic response, about what's going on. It draws us into this, notion of storytelling. And, that's really important to be drawing on all of those different modes of communication in terms of that, that looking at images, I always think about, one of my other areas is around critical literacy. So thinking about how texts are positioning us, what are the biases and the values that are embedded within text, and I always think of the, the WWF advertisements, where they've just got these really large images, which tell the whole story, and there might be a slight bit of text in there. And so, I'm often using those sorts of things in classrooms to talk to, teachers and students around, that we get a lot of the story from these particular images, rather than just reading it, they can evoke different forms of emotions. So, sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
No, I like the long-winded questions. No, I like that what Amber mentions about, being resourceful.
Add something?
Yeah,
Can I add something to that too? I just wanted to mention that in Australia, in our school curriculum, we have a sustainability priority. And it's broken into 3 parts, which is about addressing worldviews that shape the community. It's also systems, like how does one part of the system work with another, and design. And so the overlap actually in my area is we do a lot of design thinking and systems thinking in the technologies area. And so it's quite easy for me to bring in those sustainability ideas because there's such an overlap, and it's really mapped well in our curriculum too. Like if I go to the sustainability part, there's actually a little T for technologies, and if I click on that, it says this is the relationship between those things. So it's very handy.
Oh, that's really interesting. We don't have that in Canada, actually. It's not. So I had no idea that Australia, it was part of your formal public educational curriculum. I know in Sweden, Scandinavia, I think you're very similar maybe in terms of that. But Canada, I don't think so. In grade school, we have the typical waste in our world. It depends on if you go to public or private, but it's not like a mandatory requirement or regulation or anything like that. So that's actually really interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, it isn't like a separate subject or anything that's formally assessed, but it's intended to be embedded across the whole curriculum. So that's why it's so easy. That's why it's set up that way, that if you're a maths teacher or geography or whatever, you can just click on it and it will say, this is where you could teach this. So it's quite set up quite well, actually.
Okay, cool. And so this next question is built on your definition of sustainability. So SDG, as you know, those are the Sustainable Development Goals. Is there anyone that you best advocate for? And I don't know how it is, again, in Australia, if you take those literally. But do you find that these SDGs, these metrics hold merit still? Because here, at least in Canada, we take them quite literally. If you go to, for example, your local university, it's something that they use in their programming, but when I went to Sweden, I realized it's a different culture. They don't really take them as there's a lot of bashing on the SDGs because their curriculum was really based on the Anthropocene, and it's very anthropocentric and a disregard for, that eco-inclusive ethic and all the flora and fauna. And I didn't realize that in other parts of the world it's different, but I imagine Australia is maybe similar to Canada. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so certainly at our university, on a lot of our profiles, it says on there which goals we're oriented towards. So it is pretty well known here. And I guess for me, the main one is quality education.
Okay.
That's the main one I'm looking at there. If we start, obviously I'm an educator, but in my head, if we start with education, we can achieve a lot of those other goals.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with what Amber. For me, it's around quality education, particularly educating the youth, the children, the people who are going to be growing up, within this world. So that's my real interest in this particular space.
Okay, great. And what would you say for this next question? What would you say is your research's core values and intent? I know you spoke about it, but if you want to go a bit more in depth, that would be good.
So I guess because my area of research is around the digital divide and digital literacy, and I guess it's an equality thing, right? Everybody should have the same opportunities, and they don't because of who they are, where they live, etc., their governments and so on. So I guess that's my core value, is that I want to make sure everybody has the basics, everybody has access to and the ability to achieve whatever they want. In the past, I've done a lot of work with like pathway courses into university, which deals with that idea of cultural capital. If you're the first person in your family to go to university, for example, there are a lot of things you haven't picked up from the people around you in your family and so on. So how do we, and at university, because it's a much more independent way of learning, there's nobody that sits down and says to you, oh, okay, today we're all going to learn how to write an essay. It's just assumed that you know that. So how do we get everybody up to that level when there is no, certainly at the tertiary level there's an assumption that everybody has the basic skills, even though they probably don't.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Okay. That's a really interesting question. I'm just trying to formulate a response in my head. There's so many different things going through. Look, certainly for me, values as a researcher, I mean, ethical stances, always come first, in terms of, the research process itself, but also the research that we're doing. Is it ethical? Is it just? Is it, as Amber was saying, is it equitable to everybody? Certainly in my case, and I know that I've spoken a lot about multimodal texts, in my field, my research is focusing around that idea of multimodality, and we're increasingly seeing worldwide that there's this narrowing of what constitutes literacy. And so widening up that lens a little bit more to think about, well, how is it that we are being shaped by the images that we're seeing, or, by the gestures, in a play, for example, all of those different forms of communication, and how are they being embedded into us and driving, what we're thinking. So, so certainly in terms of my values and my research trajectory, that's the kinds of things that we've been focusing on.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. And now going a bit more on topic, now that we've gotten to know what you do and your research practices and your core values and intent. So first question, why does the mainstream public education system not genuinely teach children how to learn and or foster a love of learning properly? Why is it essential, I guess, to have these alternative modes of learning through digital education, technology, and things like gamification? What are your thoughts on that?
So while I do teach about technology in education, I'm not a fan of technology in education. And a lot of that is because technology has allowed governments or governing bodies and so on to collect all this data. And so the focus, there's always been a focus on outcomes, what percentage of students can do this or whatever, but it's really been ramped up now, and it's a bit insane. And teachers in Australia are spending so much time preparing for tests, doing the tests, analysing the tests, that there's not a lot of time for the actual teaching there. And so, as Kelly was saying before, there's a real narrowing. So, for example, in English education, can you spell? Can you comprehend this? Can you read that? Whatever is measurable. And so that's the focus because we can measure that. Whereas really, do we want them to be critical, like critical thinking, right? Critical literacy is not as easy to measure. So things that are creative, perhaps divergent thinking, that kind of thing, how do you capture and measure that? So I think this real focus on measurements and collecting the data and measuring it has meant that we've moved away from, this is a place where you learn to love learning to this is a place where we test to see how far you've got. And so a lot of that formative feedback is not as focused on as the summative feedback. Like it's, getting things wrong is a disaster at school, right? You don't want the big red cross. But we all know in our everyday lives when you're learning, you have to fail. You have to get it wrong because how else do you learn? So I think it's, for me, that's what it is this real shift to can we measure it?
Okay, interesting. Okay, and Kelly, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the other thing we need to be really conscious of is that, there's, when we're talking about internationally, as well, that we have lots of different contexts and, some education systems really are fostering, a love of learning, and different schools, for example, individually. So I think, we need to be really careful that we're not kind of stereotyping across, the whole broad band. I would certainly agree with Amber around this notion of testing. How do we test that, and how do we then assess these more complex skills like critical thinking, which is a really valuable part, particularly around sustainability. If we think about all of the fake news and images that are being now generated by AI, and deep fake, and all of those different tools that how are we teaching our students to be critical users and critical thinkers within that particular space, around that. So, yeah, I think what Amber said, I completely agree with.
I think Kelly needs to start answering some of the questions first because I think we're quite like-minded, so I'm probably saying all the things she's thinking.
No, it's totally fine. No, it's totally cool. But I like how you had mentioned, Amber, that it's a matter of like the generic way of teaching. They don't, in school, at least in grade schools here in Canada, they don't really teach you how to fail forward. They don't build that confidence in your learning skill set, even though you get the competency for it. So I think that's valid.
I've certainly found in teaching technologies, digital technologies, it's a place where you have to fail. How can you create new things unless you're failing? So I've certainly found with a lot of our students that they're very hesitant to use or teach technology because they're not confident in their own abilities. And they feel like the teacher needs to be the expert and know everything. And technologies are not like that because, one of the kids in your class could know a lot more about something than you do because they play that game or they've done a similar thing. And so getting comfortable with that idea that knowledge is co-constructed, you and the students work it out, and modeling like, oh, I found this new app. I'm not really sure how to use it. I know how to do this. Does anybody know how to do that? None of us know how to do this. See if we can work it all out together like that. That idea is maybe, technology is an area where, well, for our students anyway, it's quite new. And that way of thinking and also the ability to bring in other subjects to technology is quite a new, I know it's been around for a while, but it's still new in education. And a lot of people's idea of what a teacher is, they're the expert and they just give the knowledge to their students. It doesn't really work like that anymore. So it's tricky.
It is. And I think we also, have to think about that we have overarching curriculum as well, that teachers are being required to meet, and different countries have different ways of interpreting, the curriculum and what that country, feels is really important for those students to learn. So it's around this balance, about we've got this external curriculum, how do we teach that? And that's really an important aspect along with other things in there. So it's really a complex space that teachers and students are learning in.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And what I like about, I guess it's a Pokemon franchise in general, but particularly when they released Pokemon Go, because it's so accessible, because everyone seems to have a smartphone these days. The whole idea of augmented reality, and you highlight all this in your conversation article. And just on that, so when it comes to Pokemon Go, and I'm again referring to what you wrote about, what problems do you see working in the field? So, what social problem have you identified, and I guess how is your research responding to it? Because you had mentioned a bunch of relevant curriculum aspects and how what Pokemon Go or Minecraft or all these other games could possibly teach youth. Do you want to speak more about that?
Go, Cal.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of that Pokemon Go and augmented reality, again, I'm going back to my own research, around multimodal text and thinking about learning in different ways. Some of my current research is around the use of video games to teach sustainability concepts. So within my research, I think that, the United Nations, and I'm just reading off my screen to make sure I get my facts right here, they say around 3 billion people worldwide play video games. So this was a really interesting medium. They have actually quoted that they are talking about how video games are a powerful medium in terms of sustainability education and what that might look like. So I was really interested in that, and I was thinking, well, this is really interesting. It's great that, so many people play video games and that they can be an educative medium. And we know that because there has been substantial research around that. But what it comes back to is the quality of the text that we're using and the messages that are actually then being provided as part of that experience. So, some of the research around that I've been doing is I looked at 3 different video games, and I looked at how the interconnectedness of humans and nature is being depicted within there, and this understanding of eco-consciousness, and that if we are playing these kinds of games, what messages are we getting, around sustainability and sustainability concepts as humans? Are humans the savior who come in? Are humans working in orchestration with the nature, for example, to do something? And so that's just the start of a pilot study, some of the research around digital video games that I've been doing that I suppose springboarded off my multimodality, but also that Pokemon Go, that we were thinking about, how can we think about the curriculum and then the types of text that we're using. So leverage the curriculum. It is there. We have to use it as teachers and in education, but how can we introduce different ways maybe of thinking about how we can educate people around different concepts? So I'll throw it
certainly when we were brainstorming about that article, Kelly and I were just riffing off each other. You could do this, you could do this, you could do this. And I guess I certainly looked at it in terms of teacher education. So, when we talk about teachers using technology, there's usually some barriers that we commonly talk about. So a first order barrier is, for example, they don't have access. They don't have the internet, so on. The second order one is an internal one, like maybe your attitudes or your confidence. And then there's a third order barrier, which is where you've got the access, you've got the confidence and so on, but you're not really sure how to adapt the technology to the context, to the lesson, to the students and so on. And it really requires that out of the box thinking, right? So this to me this is our bread and butter, right? You look at a piece of technology, and instead of having an idea in your head that this technology can only be used for this, you start to think, well, how else could I use this technology? So, if you're using PowerPoint, yeah, there's one way to use it, but it could be a game. It could be, an animation. It could be a whole lot of things. You could do a presentation using a PDF. There's just because something is commonly used for a particular activity doesn't mean it has to be used like that. So that, divergent kind of thinking, what else could this be for, is really important. So we were just brainstorming off each other and saying, Kelly's sort of got a primary focus and I'm more of a secondary focus. What if we used it for this? What if we used it for that? And so if your focus is sustainability, of course, it's very, if you know what you want to teach, then you're saying, this is what I want to teach. This is the technology I have. how could I put those two things together and just let your imagination run wild? So I think for me, the point of that article was actually teachers, whatever the kids are into at the moment, is it fidget spinners or is it whatever it is? How could you use that in the classroom? Of course, some people would argue once you bring it into the classroom, you kill it.
Okay, great. And do you want to highlight some of the, I'll link to the article, but do you want to highlight some of the relevant curriculum examples? Is there one that you particularly think really stands out?
The one I really liked was the one we were talking about classifications.
Yes.
So I'm a mad bird watcher, for example. So to me, a lot of Pokemon Go was like bird watching because there's a particular bird you want to see and you go out and get it. But I like the idea of saying, hey, let's invent some birds or even, I suppose it depends what level you're on, or let's take some insects, for example, and try to work out what family they fit in. How can we classify these? How can we describe them? And it's a direct comparison to Pokemon Go. So it's almost like, let's make up our own Pokemon Go or make up our own Pokemons and then fit them into the game. So that was my favorite one about that.
I was just going to say, obviously for me, with a literacy focus, for me, it was around, being able to create stories, backstories, around these characters. Let's put them in different places and, write a descriptive text or take some photos and, think about then how we could teach, adjectives, for example, by, using these Pokemon Go's, and all that oral language that goes around using technology in those kinds of ways. And at the time when we wrote that, it was at the height of its popularity and everybody had smartphones. And, this was something they could just, kind of go out and hook into that student interest. Whether it's whatever that latest, thing is. Graphic novels are a great one at the moment, thinking about, that there's all of these graphic novels out there and, many students love reading them, and so they're starting to gain a lot more traction in schools as we recognise the importance of that different type of text in there. So Pokemon Go, anything, I suppose, and I know from many conversations I've had with Amber, so Amber, please jump in if you disagree. But, thinking about how can we engage students with their outside lives, in the classroom and vice versa. So, it's not this binary that, this is just what I do. How can we leverage that, whether it was Minecraft or, lots of video games or something like that. How can we leverage that in classrooms to really engage students, with pop culture and things that they're interested in outside the classroom.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think that's maybe one of the major issues is that the content you learn at school doesn't necessarily relate to your real life. And so in a lot of schools in our state, for example, mobile phones are not allowed at schools. But everybody has a mobile phone and the kids leave school and the phone is out. Like, where are we teaching them about the phone? So being able to bring in something from their real life into the classroom helps to make that connection in their head about, oh, this is actually relevant. So that's what we want, right?
I mean, it's not something, I don't think either of us are advocating that, this is something that you have to do all the time. These are, as I said, we have things that we're teaching, to students that have to be taught. They're non-negotiables. So, it's thinking about how you can kind of massage some of that content at some stage, to bring in that, contemporary, kind of text or pop culture into the classroom.
And I think we're kind of lucky in Australia too. I'm not sure about Canada or Sweden, but certainly teachers have had a lot of freedom. So we have the curriculum, but there's a million ways you could teach it. So if you're a mad gamer and you want to bring that into your classroom, that's fine. But you can also teach the same things with no technology. So it's really a lot of the content, not the curriculum, but the context within which it's delivered is up to the teacher. So, there's the sort of things everybody does and because it's just easy. But if you've got a particular passion, you can bring that with you to the classroom, which is great.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's interesting because Pokemon began as the founder creator way back when in the late 90s came about because he was an avid insect collector growing up. I think an entomologist. Hopefully I got that one right. But you mentioned bird watching, and that's how it kind of started. And I think there was a lot of hype I heard back in the day in the early 2000s where they said it's not teaching children proper values, and we'll get to that. But it's interesting that you mentioned in Canada, I'm not too sure, I don't think we have as much as, again, that curriculum, mandatory curriculum, or mandated on environmentalism, but it depends on which part of the country. So a lot of people don't realize that, but Western Canada, where I'm based, which I forgot to mention, in Alberta, we're the oil and gas capital of Canada, so like it's the Texas of Canada, people say, but we're not as big on that education, I find. And for things like French, it's not mandated in the western part of the country, but if you go out to the east, it's very different to like Toronto, Montreal. So I guess it depends on maybe the location, and I know province by province, it's pretty different in terms of what they're delivering in terms of public education. So yeah, but that is interesting to definitely hear your thoughts on that. And again, like what you were hitting on for biological classification, again, it teaches youth and younger children to explore different ecosystems, habitats, biomes, and of course, impact on human activity and wildlife. And just to kind of segue into the next question. Okay, so how would you define how education, digital technology, and gamification can be utilized as almost a viable alternative mode of delivering schooling these days? Because people are always saying the mainstream education system is broken. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I wouldn't for a start,
Okay.
but if I was going to, I guess I mentioned before that there's a lot of pedagogical aspects embedded in gaming. So, for example, Albert Bandura is a very famous person in education, and he talks a lot about self-efficacy. So how good you think you are at something. And his main, he said there's 4 different experiences that you need to have in order to develop your self-efficacy. So one of them is a mastery experience. So that's if you experience success. So when you're playing a game, you know, they think carefully about how hard it's going to be, right? So if it's really hard, you're not going to play it. So you need to get a little bit of success. So it's just, you know, success after success after success. So you feel like you're achieving as you go through it. The next one is vicarious learning, which is when you learn by watching other people. And so maybe that's a demonstration in the game, or I know my kids used to watch other people playing games on YouTube for hours. So, or maybe your friends, you know, maybe you're doing it together. Social or verbal persuasion is another one. So that's the encouragement you get. So the idea is if other people think that you can do something, then it makes you more likely to think that you can do it. And, you know, you think about games give you constant rewards. Like there's little dings, there's haptic feedback. You might get like virtual coins or something, but there's always some kind of great job. You know, you're doing well as you go through. And then the final one is your psychological or emotional state. So that's when, you know, if you don't feel safe, you're not going to learn. If you don't feel comfortable, you're not going to learn. But games are designed to be fun. They're not going to design a game that makes you too uncomfortable or you won't play it. So a lot of that. And also, you know, all those rewards are giving you a bit of a dopamine hit. I know when I'm playing games on my phone, every time I get the haptic buzz, I'm like, oh, yeah. So that's one really big thing. And the other one, which I was sort of referring to there, is the level. So Vygotsky is another sort of famous person in education, and he talked about this thing called the zone of proximal development, which is what a learner can achieve with help. So with no help, they might be here, but if a parent, teacher, friend is helping them, they might be able to achieve up here. And this zone is the zone of proximal development. All games are pitched there because if it's too high, you won't do it. If it's too low, you get bored and you don't do it. And the other thing is that one that can help you, friend, parent, teacher, whatever, is called the more knowledgeable other. And in the game, you have that. You have like an avatar or a little pop-up help thing or something that says to you, this is how you get through the level. This is how you can go on to the next thing. And a lot of it is that just-in-time learning too. Often when we're at school, you're teaching the kids something and they say, when am I ever going to use this? Because they can't see an immediate reason for using it. But in the game, you don't learn things until you need them, right? So you need this new thing. Here's the information right now, and you're going to apply it now.
Right.
So all those things, really get the student interested, motivated, feeling good about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And, often they'll get into that flow state, they're in the zone. Like, I'd love to achieve that in my normal classes. How can I do that?
That would be nice to achieve flow. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a really complex question too. I'm quite cautious around this kind of rhetoric around, the education system being broken, because we have a lot of really dedicated teachers, internationally, who are working really hard in quite diverse classrooms with, in diverse contexts with diverse students. So one approach, we couldn't just do gamification all of the time. We need a balance, in between the pedagogical, the pedagogy refers to the science and art of teaching. So why do we do what we do? Why do we make these decisions? And so for me, it's around balance. If we were just to gamify everything, students who don't learn that way, who prefer not to learn that way, actually, might start to struggle, for example. Whereas if we have that balance between, those kind of forms of didactic teaching, so that this is the explicit teaching. We need some of that in the classroom. We need gamification. We need a whole range of different strategies and pedagogies to actually be teaching students from really diverse backgrounds. So I definitely don't think it's about overhauling the education system, or trying to achieve, a balance. Often it's the teachers who are working in that, they know their classes the best. They know their students in their classes. They know the ways that they prefer to learn. They know the context that they're in. And so every school, every class has a different form of dynamic. And so, teachers, and as Amber has intimated, in Australia, we do have some freedom, around how, the different kind of pedagogical strategies that we're employing to do this kind of work. So, I always say, everything is in the middle. It's a balance. We need to, do a little bit of everything and really have a strong educational justification as to why we would be doing this. Why would I be including, for example, digital technology, or why am I including video games? Is this the best way to teach this particular concept? Is there a better way to do that? So even as teachers, there's all of this critical judgment around the types of tools and strategies that we're using in these diverse classrooms when we're thinking about teaching. I always remember when I was teaching and going back to my a bit quirky, I was wanting to teach my students about fluency, and they were struggling with that. And so I brought in SingStar, and my students, would be singing away on SingStar. And, that to me was a really great way of introducing pop culture with my educative, this is what I want to achieve with my students. It wasn't for very long, although my students did ask for it a lot, and we would do it sometimes. But, I had to think about, what is it that I want to teach? What pedagogical strategy am I going to choose? Is it going to be this kind of explicit teaching, or is it going to be more inquiry-based or more gamification? And then, what are the best tools for that? So it's a really complex intermixing of lots of different things. I often liken teaching to, a duck floating along the surface. It looks very peaceful, but underneath there's this complex series of decision making that is going on all of the time that we often don't get to see in terms of that teaching veneer.
And I guess another point about, could we use this as a viable alternative to education is that there's nothing wrong with all the traditional ways of learning, right? They're effective, they work. And certainly I find that my students really, really enjoy discussions. Because imagine you're playing a game, you've got whoever created the game is feeding you the information you need, and you're learning that information. But how good is that information? And when you are in a classroom and you're discussing things, that diversity comes out because people tell you about their own experiences, their own understanding, their own views on how things are. And as a student, you get to hear a whole range of views. You might agree with some and disagree with others, but you're exposed to a range. And in a game, you're not exposed to a range. There's a correct way to do things, and that's about it. So I guess you can see easily how it might work to learn your times tables, but a game might not teach you critical thinking. So there's some areas where maybe it would work, and some areas where maybe it wouldn't work. So I think you have to just be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because a lot of traditional stuff works fantastically well. This, using technology is just another tool for teachers. It's important. I mean, we can't pretend it's not there. We need to have our students finishing school with good digital literacy, but we have to think very carefully about how it's incorporated into our schooling.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for your insightful answer. I liked how Kelly mentioned that it has to be multifaceted across the spectrum. There's not like one size fits all solution. And do you find, just building on that, learning alternatives in the classroom, such as experiential learning, which you had mentioned in the article, in which children and younger persons are more engaged? Do you find that they're more engaged through this interactive role play, through things like Pokemon Go? And do you find that augmented reality is going to be, I guess, a prominent part of the future of public education? So, and my thought actually goes to like what happened during the pandemic. So I don't know if your restrictions were as harsh as they were in especially Canada and the US, but it was pretty bad. I know everything from the get-go of grade school up to university was closed, especially my campus, I think at least for a year and a half. So I know that affected a lot of children transitioning back to in-person learning. And I wonder if and there's research anyways, saying how youth are going to develop more mental health issues and learning disabilities because of this gap in their education. Do you think things like this could help with, like, I guess, could somehow support them, provide that level of support?
I think what you've got to think when you, certainly there's been a big push in Australia and probably in Canada as well for getting more stuff online, blended learnings, lots of stuff online. So you've got the face-to-face and the online stuff. And, in Melbourne, where we live, we were the most locked down city in the world. We had a lot of time at home.
Yes, I went to Sweden and I realized they didn't lock down. I'm like, what are we? I think it's maybe just the English speaking. It could be countries, but it's
But I think what you always have to keep in mind is the best experience for learning is face to face. Like that's the number one, is actually being with real people. And then if you can't do that, then okay, let's have a look at some alternatives. And so that's kind of what was happening during COVID. I've noticed, for example, that at our university, people don't hang around the campus as much as they used to. So because even for us, so we have the option of doing a lot of our meetings online. So I, often will only go in when I'm teaching, and the rest of the time I work from home and I just have my meetings online. And you miss that whole social aspect. You miss bumping into people in the hallway and, just having a coffee and chatting about whatever. That whole part is gone. And, for students, if you're in an online classroom, for example, you can't nudge the person next to you and say, hey, what are you supposed to do here? I wasn't paying attention. There's none of that side chatter happening. And actually, that's a huge part of learning, right? You don't learn everything from the teacher. You learn some of it from the person sitting next to you because they explained it better than the teacher did, right? So all that part is missing. I think, we're starting to get people coming through the education system now who were very young when COVID hit. So they're sort of moving into high school now, I guess. I do recall going into a school straight after COVID and the teachers just, shaking their heads saying we've missed, they're at least a year behind. Will they catch up academically? I don't know. I don't think we know. In terms of mental health, yeah, it's tricky. It's a bit hard to say, certainly there are a lot of mental health issues among young people, but I think it's very complex, what's caused them. I don't think you can sort of label it on one or two things. And, in my head, I'm thinking it's much better to come to a class and talk to people and socialize than to stay at home. So there's so many things going on in the whole education sector.
Right.
which has really changed education. And I think it's kind of too soon to say what we should keep, what we shouldn't. So I know some places are, like our university was quite adamant that everybody should come back to university physically as soon as they could.
Okay.
But I know some other universities here are still doing online classes. So too soon to tell, I think.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, and Kelly, do you have anything on that or any thoughts on that issue?
I was just going to say, following up from Amber, that it's complex. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, it's about thinking about the context that you're in, and thinking about, what is the best approach, what are the best tools, what are the best pedagogical strategies, around that, and again, a balance for me is always my priority. Yeah. Getting a little bit of both, and seeing what works. But again, I can kind of give you that anecdotal, kind of information, but it's not my specific research area. So, I can kind of say, yeah, for me, it's all about balance.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.